station. Any unattended articles are likely to be removed without warning.
This is the Hour of History Cities podcast with your host, Stephen Bauman. The Hour of History Cities podcast, as well as other Hour of History podcasts, can be streamed and downloaded at hourofhistory.com, iTunes, Google Music, our YouTube channel, and TuneIn. Be sure to also check out our Hour of History blog at hourofhistory.com/blog. And now we begin the Hour of History Cities podcast with your host, Stephen Bauman.
Hello and welcome back to Hour of History Cities podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Bauman, and we're continuing our tour of the Russia World Cup 2018 host cities. Last week we talked about Moscow, which is going to be one of the most important cities with its two host stadiums that are going to cover the final and the opening match. It's kind of hard to improve on Moscow, and I think most people will be going to Moscow, but there's another major city that's both important in Russian history and is going to be central to this 2018 Russia World Cup. You probably guessed it, that city is St. Petersburg. The city we now know today as St. Petersburg has gone through many carnations. It's gone through many different rulers, many different leaderships, but it was founded in 1703. And as you might have guessed, it was founded by a very famous Russian figure, Tsar Peter the Great. So the Tsars were the Russian leaders. It's the Russian version of the word Caesar. These were monarchs. They had total power. And Peter the Great, he's sort of known as the modernizer of the Russian Empire. He did things like outlawing beards and tried to bring peasants out from the rural areas and into the cities. And one of his moves was to make St. Petersburg the capital city of Imperial Russia because of its location. I talked about how Moscow was always facing those invasions from the Mongols and the Central Asian peoples. It's really close to Central Asia. Peter the Great, you know, usually when you're given the Great behind you is a indication that you have a profound impact on a society, or that you just have a really good namer. I don't know what we're gonna call me after I pass, but maybe Stephen the Podcaster or Stephen the Great. I'll take either one. But anyway, let's get back to St. Petersburg. So it was founded by Tsar Peter the Great in 1703, and the idea of it was we're going to build a new capital. It's going to be a better, more European Russian imperial capital. It's going to be closer to Europe. So it was built on the Baltic Sea and the Neva River. So like I mentioned, most of these cities typically, in a lot of cases, grow up around rivers because rivers provide a source of transportation. They provide a source of water. Rivers are good. They're good to have a river running through your city, especially in the days before cities like Los Angeles can pump water over mountains from a distance. So St. Petersburg is formed around a river as well as the Baltic Sea, which gives it access to Europe. It's very close to the modern nations that we now know as Finland and Estonia. So he names it St. Petersburg, which is St. Petersburg in German. He's not naming it after himself, he's naming it after the patron saint, St. Peter, very famous and well known in the Catholic Church as having the key to Rome in the Orthodox Church as well. So this is sort of that appeal that the Russians are making and the Imperial Russians continue to make to this religious centrality to the world. So he forms this St. Petersburg. It's the capital of Russia for over 200 years. And it is the most important city in Imperial Russia for a lot of reasons, not to mention that it's a center of trade, center of culture, center of sort of communication with the European world. St. Petersburg pulls Russia towards Europe, which is also sort of one of the purposes of this World Cup. It's going to bring Russia into the world, the global conversation. It's going to make Russia sort of this great nation, and it's also going to bring it closer to Europe. At least that's the goal. Well, in 1914, as you may know, Russia gets involved in World War I, and fighting against the Germans. You don't want your capital city to be named in honor of the Germans after, in German language, so they changed the name in 1914. It becomes Petrograd. Petro is just Peter in Russian, and Grad is a different ending, a Russian suffix that means city rather than Berg, which is the German suffix meaning city. So 1914, St. Petersburg becomes Petrograd. St. Petersburg's status as the capital then doesn't last so long because something else big happens in 1917. We've sort of talked about it. It's the Soviet Revolution, the October Revolution, and one of the things of the October Revolution in issuing in this new communist system is to get rid of the sort of association with the church, and so St. Petersburg is and as well as the monarchy, and St. Petersburg that becomes a problem, that name. So it's renamed after Vladimir Lenin, central to the Bolshevik Revolution, and the city changes its name to Leningrad. So City of Lenin in 1924, the year that Lenin dies. Now, Leningrad remains an important city in Russia, but it's no longer the capital. The Soviets moved the capital to Moscow, which becomes the capital of the Soviet Union. But Leningrad remains significant. In fact, the Germans make it a point to take Leningrad in World War II. The siege of Leningrad, which lasts between 1942 and 1944, is one of the longest sieges that we've ever seen in world history. Lasts over 800 days, almost 900 days, in which the Germans totally suffocate the city on their way to Moscow. Now, beyond that history and looking towards the sort of symbols of the city and the crest of the city like I did with Russia, the coat of arms of St. Petersburg is a simple design. It's just a red field with two anchors crossing diagonally, forming an X and a scepter straight up the center. So this symbol remains the same when it's Leningrad, when it's the Royal Imperial City, and even after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, when it goes back to being called St. Petersburg. The symbolism is these two anchors crossing. You have an anchor for the river and an anchor for the Baltic Sea. So two types of anchors, and the scepter in the center sort of shows that the centrality of rule, how this city has been important to the successful rule of Russia for over 200 years. And what's interesting also about this shield is it's almost identical to that of the Vatican City, whereas the Vatican City has the keys of St. Peter's crossing, the key to Rome, the key to the church, crossing over a red field, and the hat of the Pope in the center. So very similar, modeled after the Vatican City, and or after Rome anyway, and St. Petersburg sort of retains that tie. Now, in talking about what happens after 1991, the decision is made to go back from Leningrad to St. Petersburg. There's still some signage up around St. Petersburg that shows that it was once called Leningrad. It hasn't been a total purge of sort of the Soviet memory, and those sort of things exist, especially because during the October Revolution, when the Bolsheviks come to power, they storm some of the amazing historic buildings that are still around St. Petersburg, which, as you might have guessed, is a UNESCO heritage site. So some things to see in St. Petersburg, of course, are the Winter Palace, which is where the October Revolution takes place, the former seat of the Tsars that's taken over by this Bolshevik Revolution. There's also the Hermitage Museum, one of the largest art museums in the world that's along the Neva River, and the church, there are various churches, but one of the Church of the Savior on spilled blood. So you can really get into Russian imperial history, which is absolutely fascinating. You can get into Soviet history, which is also likewise absolutely fascinating. And you can just walk around because it's an absolutely beautiful city built on a lot of water. And whenever you have a city built on water, it tends to be rather attractive. There's 5 million people in St. Petersburg, so it's a major metropolis. It's not quite as big as Moscow. It's no longer the capital, but it's easier to get to if you're coming by train from Central or Europe or Scandinavia. And I'm sure a lot of people will make the journey. The matches that are going to be played in St. Petersburg are going to be played in Krestovsky Stadium, which is the home of FC Zenit. Zenit is the team of St. Petersburg. They've been represented in Europe for quite some time now. They're a rather successful Russian soccer club. And the stadium that they play in, this Krestovsky Stadium, is going to hold 67,000 people in the World Cup. It cost $1 billion to build and took about 10 years. It was built between 2007 and 2017. And it's just an absolutely fabulous stadium. It's going to feature games including Russia, so there's going to be big Russian crowds. It's Russia versus Egypt on 19th of June, Argentina and Nigeria on 26th of June, and Brazil and Costa Rica on the 22nd of June. So there's going to be some absolutely extraordinary action in St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg is also going to play host to a match in the round of 16, the semifinal, and the third place match. All of those taking place in subsequent weeks in July, the 3rd, the 10th, and the 14th, respectively. So in the end, St. Petersburg sounds like another one of those cities for the Russian World Cup that's just going to make an absolutely positive impact for Russia. It's really going to show off sort of this European metropolitan modern side of Russia. St. Petersburg's a beautiful city. It has enormous amount of art and cultural heritage, as well as being pretty well linked up to the rest of Europe. And I'm sure the soccer played in the stadium will match that. So St. Petersburg, whatever you want to call it, whatever sort of, we've gone back to the German ending, but I'm sure that the locals there would be more than willing to have a conversation with you about the name and what they call their own city and what Peter actually means to them. So I encourage you to do that, and I hope you will enjoy your time in St. Petersburg. So we've covered a couple cities. We've covered Moscow and St. Petersburg. There's 3 of our 10 stadiums and 2 of the most important cities, considering that the opening match and the final and the third place match and the semifinal are going to be covered in these cities. So with that said, thank you for listening to the Hour of History Cities podcast. This is a special World Cup edition, and I'm going to be continuing touring Russia, talking a little bit about the historical, cultural backgrounds of these cities that are going to play host to the world's greatest sporting event. Remember, on Hour of History, it's our world, anytime, any place. Thanks for listening.